The acrid stench of burning insulation and scorched dough filled the pre-dawn silence of the bakery. But it wasn't the failing oven that made Marco's blood run cold. In the flickering light of a single dying bulb, he stood in the pantry, his flour-dusted fingers trembling as they gripped a thick legal folder he'd stumbled upon in his sister's designer bag. Outside the door, the muffled sound of his family's laughter and the clink of celebratory wine glasses drifted in from the dining room, a sharp contrast to the cold, black and white lines of the document in his hands. His eyes locked onto the bottom of the final page, where his father's heavy, slanted signature sat fresh and drying next to a corporate seal. A sudden, violent shudder rocked the ancient building as a construction crew's heavy machinery rumbled to life just outside the window. The first metal stake piercing the pavement of the only home he had ever known. Marco looked at the decades of sweat-stained flour sacks surrounding him and realized that while he was preparing a feast for his family, they had already finished carving up his life. The alarm clock remained silent on the nightstand, its digital numbers glowing a faint red. But Marco DeLuca's eyelids snapped open as if a wire had been pulled. In the pre-dawn gloom of South Philadelphia, his fingers reflexively gripped the edge of the cotton sheet, the fabric rough against his calloused palms. 4 in the morning brought a specific scent through the cracked window, a cocktail of cooling asphalt and the damp, briny breath of the Delaware River. Marco swung his legs out of bed, his joints popping like dry kindling. He descended the narrow, creaking stairs of the row house, his feet finding each tread by muscle memory alone, navigating the darkness without a single stumble. Inside the bakery, a tomb-like silence reigned, heavy with the ghosts of yesterday's loaves. Marco reached into the massive flour bin, his arms disappearing into the white powder up to the elbows. As he pulled back, a fine white cloud billowed upward, settling like premature snow on his salt and pepper hair. The humidity of the Philadelphia morning made his bones ache, a dull throb in his lower back that had become his constant companion. He ignored it, pouring water into the flour and beginning the rhythmic labor of the mix. The heavy, wet mass made a rhythmic, squelching sound under his knuckles as he drove his fists into the dough. Each strike against the scarred wooden table sent a vibration through the floorboards, a steady percussion that finally chased the last lingering shadows of sleep from his mind. Marco paused, wiping his flour-streaked palms against the heavy canvas of his apron. He stood motionless before a dark, irregular smudge on the far wall, just past the racks of cooling trays. Beneath decades of accumulated soot, steam, and grease, the faint outlines of an old charcoal sketch flickered in the low light. It was a ghost from 30 years ago, a jagged horizon line he had drawn when his heart still beat for something other than bread. Marco reached out, his fingertips grazing a jagged crack in the plaster where he had once envisioned a Venetian sunset, vibrant and bleeding with color. Instead of a palette and brushes, his hands had adapted to the searing heat of steel pans and the abrasive texture of 50-pound grain sacks. His gaze drifted to the faded, sepia-toned photographs of his parents hanging near the entrance, their youthful faces frozen in a pose of immigrant pride. Every deep-set wrinkle around Marco's eyes felt like an unrecorded entry in a ledger of family debt, a debt he had spent his prime paying off through sweat and a deteriorating spine, while the oils in his hidden tubes dried into useless stones. The ritual continued as Marco reached for the heavy brass lever of the gas main. He braced himself for the familiar, comforting roar of the pilot light catching, a sound that usually signaled the start of the world. Instead, a shrill metallic screech erupted from the belly of the ancient oven, a sound like a blade dragging across a whetstone. Marco flinched as the massive steel door shuddered under the force of an internal jolt. A sharp, Dry snap echoed through the kitchen, followed immediately by the acrid, chemical sting of burning wires. He slammed his palm against the control panel, his breath hitching, but the indicator lights remained stubbornly dark, like dead eyes. Cold sweat broke out across his forehead, stinging the small burns on his brow. On the long wooden tables, the mounds of raw dough began to sag, losing their internal tension and turning into a sticky, useless sludge. He watched them deflate, realizing that every passing minute of silence was $1 lost. A customer turned away, and a piece of his history crumbling. Marco pressed the grimy telephone receiver against his ear, his shoulders hunched as he listened to the technician's flat, uninterested drone. His fingers tightened around a crumpled estimate, the 5-digit figure scrawled in thick black marker, looking like a death warrant. With a trembling hand, he popped the drawer of the cash register. The bell rang with a hollow tinny sound, revealing only a few lonely $20 bills and a pathetic scatter of copper and nickel. A hard lump formed in his throat as he turned toward the empty shelves, which by now should have been sagging under the weight of crusty loaves and seeded rolls. He sank onto a tall, backless stool, the oppressive weight of the high ceilings and the grease-stained walls suddenly feeling like they were bowing inward. The cost of the repair was more than 3 months of total revenue, and as the silence of the bakery grew heavier, Marco realized the bank would never approve another cent. There would be no miracle on this corner of South Philly today. The silence of the narrow street was suddenly shattered by the aggressive snarl of a high-performance engine. A black, polished SUV, its paint gleaming like a fresh bruise, lurched to a halt directly in front of the bakery's faded green door. The driver's side door swung open, and a stiletto heel with a signature red sole struck the cracked concrete of the sidewalk. Julia DeLuca stepped out, sliding a pair of oversized designer sunglasses up into her perfectly coiffed hair despite the overcast sky. As she used her key fob to lock the vehicle, the gold bracelets on her wrist clattered together with a sharp, expensive chime. She paused for a moment, her gaze raking over the peeling paint of the DeLuca's bakery sign with a subtle twitch of her lip, a flicker of pure distaste. As she approached the door, she brought with her the scent of a floral, high-end perfume that felt violently out of place against the backdrop of sourdough and industrial-grade floor cleaner. Marco began setting out trays of miniature cannoli, his fingers fumbling with the delicate shells as he tried to mask the tremor in his hands. He didn't even have time to greet her before his parents practically charged toward the door, their faces lighting up in a way they never did for him. They swarmed Julia, smothering her in kisses and frantic Italian endearments, their hands fluttering over the silk fabric of her designer's suit. They hung on her every word as she began a rapid-fire monologue about international mergers and the pressures of the high-stakes investment world. Marco stood back in the shadows of the prep area, mopping sweat from his neck with a graying towel. But his mother only spared him a sharp wave of her hand. She barked a command for him to fetch more ice and fresh napkins, as if he were a ghost in his own home. To them, Marco was merely a functional part of the architecture, a silent backdrop designed to facilitate the comfort of Julia's triumphant return. The anniversary dinner hit its stride, the air thick with the smell of roasted garlic and the cacophony of raised voices. Marco's father stood at the head of the table, his wine glass held high as he launched into a boisterous toast celebrating Julia's brilliant mind and her meteoric rise in the corporate world. While the table erupted in applause, Marco moved like a shadow in the periphery, clearing away empty bottles and replacing soiled plates. His mother nudged him sharply in the ribs as he passed, whispering a demand for the main course to be served immediately, her tone carrying the cold edge she reserved for hired help. Julia sat enthroned at the center of the table, basking in the adoration, never once meeting Marco's eye as he balanced a heavy tray of veal over her shoulder. Every word of praise heaped upon his sister felt like a fresh burn, more painful than any splash of hot oil from the ovens. As the guests migrated toward the living room for coffee, a fragile quiet descended on the hallway. Marco leaned down to retrieve a fallen linen napkin, and his boot caught the strap of Julia's designer handbag, which she had carelessly tossed onto the entryway bench. The bag tipped, and a sleek folder with gold-embossed lettering slid onto the floor, along with several loose sheets of paper. Marco reached down to tidy the mess, but his hand froze mid-air. The bold, legal typeface at the head of the top document acted like a magnet for his eyes. His heart skipped a beat, then began a frantic, uneven thud against his ribs as he recognized the bakery's specific lot and block number. His fingers clamped onto the heavy, expensive paper of their own accord. He cast a quick, panicked look over his shoulder toward the closed living room door, where Julia's sharp, melodic laughter rang out over the clink of porcelain. Marco ducked into the dark pantry, pulling the string on a single, dim bulb that cast long, skeletal shadows across the stacks of flour sacks. His eyes raced over the legal jargon, his mind struggling to process the cold reality of the words. A contract for the purchase of the land and the building. The buyer was a massive real estate development firm with a portfolio of luxury lifestyle centers. The purchase price, followed by a dizzying string of zeros, was slated to be wired directly into Julia's personal accounts. Each paragraph felt like a physical blow, a systematic dismantling of his 30 years of labor. He turned a page, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged in the cramped, dusty space. The scent of dry grain, which had always been his comfort, now felt like it was choking him. On the final page of the document, Marco's eyes locked onto the signatures. He recognized his father's heavy, slanted scrawl and his mother's precise, shaky script right next to the notary's official seal. The date was from a week ago, a night Marco remembered vividly because he had stayed until midnight scrubbing the grease from the floor tiles. The realization hit him with the force of an icy wave. Behind his back, his own blood had bartered away his existence. They had turned the bakery, his only sanctuary, into a chip to be cashed in for Julia's lifestyle. His vision blurred as he realized that the people he had sacrificed his dreams for had erased his life with a few strokes of a pen, not even bothering to give him the courtesy of a warning before the planned demolition. Marco emerged from the pantry feeling a strange, hollow lightness in his chest, as if his internal organs had been replaced by dry straw. He drifted back toward the dining room and stopped in the doorway, watching Julia lean over to refill their mother's wine glass, her smile radiant and hollow. He looked at his father's face and no longer saw the stern patriarch, but a co-conspirator who had traded his son's future for a comfortable exit. Julia caught his eye for a split second, her gaze sharpening into a predatory squint before she smoothly returned to her anecdote. Marco studied these faces, the people who shared his name but not his soul, and saw only a calculated betrayal dressed up as a family celebration. Every gesture Julia made now seemed like a choreographed lie performed on the grave of his life's work. With practiced mechanical movements, Marco slid the documents back into Julia's bag, smoothing the leather so no trace of his discovery remained. He walked slowly back into the kitchen, where the broken oven sat like a cold, steel carcass, and the air was thick with the smell of dough beginning to turn sour. He rested his palms on the cold metal of the stove, the machine that had been his most loyal companion through thousands of solitary nights. This was no longer a family legacy. It was a legally terminated altar where he had spent his life as the sacrifice. Marco slid down the side of the lifeless machine until he was sitting on the floor, his back against the cold steel, staring into the dark corners of the room. A single thought pulsed in his mind with the rhythm of a funeral bell. For this bakery, and for the man he was supposed to be, there would be no tomorrow. Marco's hand trembled only slightly as he lowered the gold-embossed folder onto the kitchen table's sticky yellow oilcloth. It landed with a soft thud between a plate of cold eggs and a steaming mug of coffee. Julia froze, a silver fork halfway to her mouth, her lips tightening into a thin, bloodless line. Their father didn't look up. He kept stirring his coffee, his eyes fixed on the gray blur of traffic through the window, while their mother's hands vanished beneath the table to twist a linen napkin into a tight rope. Marco leaned forward, his knuckles white as he pressed them into the table, making the mismatched china rattle. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room, punctuated only by the rising whistle of the tea kettle. He stared at Julia, waiting for her to defend herself, but she remained motionless, her eyes locked on the contract's header as if she were trying to incinerate the paper with her gaze. Marco's father set his spoon down with a sharp clack against the saucer. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he pushed the folder toward the edge of the table, where it sat among breadcrumbs and coffee rings. The skin on the old man's face looked like yellowed parchment as he twisted his mouth into a cold, indifferent sneer. He tapped a bony finger against the cracked plaster of the wall, declaring that these old bricks had outlived their usefulness years ago. To him, the bakery had become a lead weight, an anchor dragging Julia down and preventing her from reaching the heights she deserved. Marco watched as his father nodded at Julia, a silent confirmation that 30 years of Marco's life was nothing more than a pile of junk to be traded for the hollow shimmer of her success. Julia exploded out of her chair, the sudden movement causing her chair to screech against the linoleum. Her voice, sharp and high-pitched, cut through the room like a serrated blade, drowning out the ambient noise of the Philadelphia street outside. She paced the small kitchen, her rings catching the light as she gestured wildly, screaming that Marco was a relic of a dead century, a man who chose to rot among flour sacks. Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson as she accused him of being too dim-witted to grasp the scope of her vision. She jabbed a finger toward the boarded-up window, shouting that the world had moved on while he remained a pathetic appendage to a broken oven. Marco recoiled, stunned by the sheer velocity of her rage. Her ambition felt like a live wire, sparking and dangerous in the cramped space. The front door's heavy latch groaned, announcing the arrival of uninvited guests. 3 men in identical charcoal suits filed into the bakery's retail area, their presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. Marco watched from the kitchen doorway as one of the men snapped open a metal tape measure near the pastry case, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Another man slapped his palm against the hand-carved oak counter, checking for structural integrity with a casual disrespect that made Marco's blood boil. They spoke in clipped, professional shorthand, scribbling notes into digital tablets and ignoring Marco as if he were part of the furniture. Their polished shoes left muddy tracks on the floor Marco had spent hours scrubbing. The rhythmic snap-zip of the measuring tapes felt like a countdown, turning his sanctuary into a mere coordinate on a developer's map. Marco stepped forward, his chest tight as he blocked the path of the man with the tape measure. But Julia surged between them with predatory speed. She snatched a document with a heavy blue seal from her folder and thrust it inches from Marco's face. His eyes blurred as he tried to read the sprawling notary's signature on the general power of attorney. A triumphant, jagged smile spread across Julia's face as she flaunted the paper that gave her total dominion over every brick and board in the building. Marco looked to his parents for some sign of resistance, but they averted their eyes, their silence a final, crushing confirmation of the conspiracy. Julia stepped aside with a graceful, mocking wave of her hand, clearing the path for the appraisers, leaving Marco standing in the center of the room, stripped of even the right to complain. His mother's hand clamped onto his elbow, her grip surprisingly strong as she pulled him into the shadows behind the industrial refrigerator. The air there was stagnant, smelling of old yeast and damp earth. Her eyes were wet and wide with a frantic, desperate light. And her whisper was a ragged hiss as she began to spill the truth about Julia's debts. She squeezed Marco's hand so hard her nails bit into his skin, pleading with him to understand that Julia was facing a prison cell because of unfortunate investment risks. Marco listened to the litany of empty accounts and threats from creditors, the cold realization dawning on him that his decades of labor had been sold to provide a getaway car for his sister's crimes. His mother pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, sobbing quietly while Marco stood paralyzed, realizing his entire life had been nothing but a commodity to be liquidated. Marco reached into the mailbox and pulled out a damp envelope marked with a bold red stamp. The paper felt cold and thin against his fingertips. The official notice was brief. In 72 hours, the gas lines would be capped and the electricity severed. He reread the lines about the scheduled demolition until the letters began to swim and merge into a single black blot. The scent of gas and toasted grain that had defined his existence was about to be replaced by the dry, choking dust of pulverized stone. He leaned his back against the warm brick of the facade, trying to memorize the vibration of the city through the walls. In his head, a silent timer began to tick, counting down the final breaths of his world while the city outside prepared to erase his name from the block. A sharp, rhythmic tearing sound erupted from the small back office, and Marco hurried down the hall, stopping dead in the doorway. Julia was seated at the desk, her expression one of focused, clinical detachment as she systematically ripped pages from the old ledger books. These were the books Marco had kept for 30 years. Every entry written in his careful slanted hand. Scraps of paper detailing flower deliveries from the 1990s and secret family recipes fluttered into a plastic trash bin like autumn leaves. She didn't even look up when he reached out to stop her. The ink on the pages looked like dried blood to him, a paper trail of a life being deleted in real time. She tossed the empty leather binding into the heap, wiping away the documentary evidence of his existence as easily as one might brush crumbs from a table. Marco's father spread a series of glossy brochures across the kitchen table, the high-quality paper shimmering with images of a premier residential experience. He spoke in a dry, matter-of-fact tone, informing Marco that the move was scheduled for next Wednesday. The new apartment Julia had purchased for them featured 2 bedrooms and a glass-walled terrace. But as Marco scanned the floor plan, he saw no mention of a 3rd occupant. His father adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, looking through Marco as if he were a pane of glass, and suggested he start looking for a room closer to some other line of work. Marco stood before the old man, feeling like a piece of outdated equipment that had been left out of the inventory during a liquidation sale. The telephone receiver felt heavy as lead as Marco listened to the apologetic voice of his flower supplier. The man, who had been a friend for 20 years, explained that Julia had already called to terminate the standing contract and settle the final balance. Marco looked at the massive, empty grain hoppers in the back room, knowing that for the first time in a century, the delivery truck would not arrive tomorrow morning. Every connection he had to the outside world had been severed with a single phone call from his sister, leaving him stranded in a warehouse of shadows. He placed the receiver back on the hook and was met with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, a hollow ringing in his ears that signaled the end of his professional life. Julia dropped to her knees on the linoleum in front of Marco, her fingers digging into the fabric of his flour-dusted work trousers. Their parents stood behind her like silent sentinels, their eyes boring into him with a mute, heavy expectation. Julia began to sob, her voice a ragged plea for him to sign the final equipment release for the developers, calling it the only way to keep the handcuffs off her wrists. Marco felt the heat of her palms through his clothes, and the physical proximity made his skin crawl. She swore on their grandmother's memory that this would be the last sacrifice she would ever ask of him. while his mother nodded in a slow, rhythmic trance. Marco looked down at the expensive pen she held out to him, realizing that his signature was the last thing they needed to finish burying him. A series of dull, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the floorboards as workers began propping heavy sheets of plywood against the front windows. Marco stood in the center of the retail floor, watching as the rectangles of morning light were snuffed out one by one. A thick veil of dust rose into the air, settling on his shoulders like ash as the room descended into a murky, artificial twilight. Outside, the muffled shouts of a foreman and the screech of metal on metal drifted in. But inside the bakery, the air became still and vault-like. He didn't move as the final nails were driven home, the sound echoing through the hollow space, effectively entombing him in the wreckage of his own life. Marco stood in the thick, suffocating gloom of the kitchen, where the only light came from thin, golden needles of sun stabbing through the gaps in the plywood. Outside, the world was a cacophony of hydraulic hammers and grinding gears that made the glass jars on the shelves dance and chime. But he didn't look up. His hands, mapped with deep, permanent cracks and white scars from old burns, disappeared into the cool, elastic mass of the final batch of dough. He worked the dough with a slow, deliberate rhythm, pressing the heels of his hands into the wood and ignoring the way the floorboards shivered beneath his boots. The comforting, acidic scent of yeast fought against the sharp, oily tang of diesel fumes leaking in from the street. Every motion Marco made was heavy with the grace of a man performing a final rite, a quiet labor of love conducted amidst the literal collapse of his world. The kitchen door was kicked open with a violence that sent the handle through the drywall. Julia charged into the room, bringing with her a sharp, cold wind and the expensive scent of imported tobacco. She slammed a large, empty suitcase onto the floor. It skidded across the linoleum and struck Marco's shins with a hollow thud. Her face was a frantic mask of sweat and smeared makeup, her manicured fingers trembling as she pointed toward the wall where the roar of an excavator's engine seemed to be vibrating the very bricks. She screamed at him, her voice cracking as she shrieked that the perimeter fence was already up and that within the hour, the entire structure would be nothing but a memory. Marco didn't turn around. He kept his rhythm, the dough yielding under his fists, while Julia kicked the leg of the heavy work table in a fit of impotent fury. Marco stopped, slowly wiping the flour from his forearms. He knelt by the wall, reaching into a dark, recessed space beneath the bottom shelf of the cooling rack. With a sharp, dry creak, he pried up a loose floorboard and pulled out a stack of ledger books bound in fraying black cloth and several bulging accordion folders. He stood and began laying them out on the floured table one by one, the sound of each impact punctuating the silence like a judge's gavel. The paper was yellowed and brittle, smelling of damp basements and 30 years of stagnant air. He placed his hand on the top book, the dust of decades coating his palm. In the sudden, tense silence that followed, the only sound was the frantic dance of dust motes in the narrow shafts of light, illuminating the documentary evidence of a life he had kept hidden from everyone. His father's hand shot out, a trembling claw reaching to sweep the folders onto the floor as if they were trash. Marco moved faster, his hands slamming down onto the papers with a force that made the table groan, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white as he pinned his history to the wood. He stared directly into his father's watery, clouded eyes, the intensity of his gaze freezing the old man in place. Julia took a stumbling step back as Marco flipped open the first ledger, revealing page after page of dense, meticulous columns of figures. The father's angry gesture withered under the sheer weight of his son's newfound resolve. The family stood paralyzed, anchored to the spot by the physical weight of these books that Marco would no longer allow them to ignore. Marco's voice was a low, steady rumble, that seemed to vibrate in his chest, holding its own against the distant screech of metal on concrete. He began to read aloud, his finger tracing dates and amounts. The checks he had written to cover Julia's gambling debts in her 20s, the tuition payments he'd made while working 20-hour shifts, the medical bills for their mother that he'd paid while hiding his own agonizing hernia under a tight canvas belt. He displayed the bank statements that proved he hadn't bought a new pair of shoes or a winter coat in 5 years so Julia could maintain her image in the city. Julia tried to look away, but he forced the papers into her line of sight, making the numbers burn into her. Each word he spoke stripped away another layer of her manufactured success, revealing the ugly truth that her life had been built on his broken back. His mother erupted, her voice a piercing shriek that ricocheted off the tiled walls, drowning out the rumble of the construction equipment. She shook her fists at the ceiling, screaming that he was a monster for keeping a ledger of family love and sacred duty. Her face turned a dangerous shade of purple as she shrieked that the bakery had never been anything more than a tool to ensure Julia's future, and that Marco was merely the servant who had been born to facilitate it. She spat at the floor, claiming his petty sacrifices were nothing compared to the brilliance of his sister's potential. Marco listened to the venomous torrent, his body as still as a statue, as his mother finally shed the last of her maternal warmth, revealing the cold, calculating heart beneath. Julia's frantic energy suddenly vanished, replaced by a terrifying porcelain-smooth mask of pure contempt. She let out a short, barking laugh that was more chilling than any of her mother's screams. She leaned across the table until her face was inches from Marco's, her breath smelling of mint and bile, and hissed that all his noble suffering made her want to vomit. She told him to his face that she had always seen him as a pathetic loser, a man who found comfort in the dirt and flour because he was too afraid to be anything else. She sneered that she had never asked for his help, and that he had only given it to make himself feel superior. Marco looked into her eyes and saw a bottomless hatred for the man who served as a living reminder of her own failures. The entire building shuddered as a massive, thunderous impact vibrated through the foundation. The steel bucket of an excavator had just taken its first bite of the bakery's facade. A thick, choking rain of gray plaster and century-old dust cascaded from the ceiling, coating the anniversary leftovers and Marco's ledgers in a layer of fine ash. The glass chandelier above the table began to swing in a wide, frantic arc, casting distorted shadows across the terrified faces of his parents. His mother threw her arms over her head, ducking as if under fire, while his father gripped the edge of the table to keep from being thrown from his chair. The air in the kitchen turned a gritty, opaque gray, transforming the room into a scene of urban warfare where Marco's world was literally disintegrating around him. Through the swirling veil of dust, Marco looked at his parents. They were frantically brushing the gray soot from their expensive clothes, their eyes darting around the room, but never once settling on him. He saw his father clutching a glossy brochure for the new luxury condo as if it were a holy relic that would protect him from the falling ceiling. In that moment, a cold clarity settled over Marco. These people had never seen a son. They had seen an appliance, a reliable machine that provided heat and bread without complaint. Their faces looked like stone masks to him now, carved by selfishness and old age. He realized they would step over his cooling corpse without a second thought if it meant they didn't have to give up the comfort Julia had promised them. Julia lunged for the table, her fingers hooked like talons as she tried to grab the folders and shove them into a nearby trash bin. Marco reacted with a sudden, explosive movement of his shoulder, shoving her back with a force that sent her reeling toward the industrial sink. Her elbow struck the brass faucet with a sickening crack, and she let out a sharp cry of shock. She stared at him, her eyes wide and glassy with a newfound fear. For 30 years, he had been the one who yielded, the one who absorbed their blows and their demands. but now his body was rigid, his gaze an immovable wall. She tried to summon a retort, but the words died in her throat as he took a single, slow step toward her. The invisible chain that had bound him to her whims didn't just break, it vanished. His father stood up, his frame shaking with a helpless, impotent rage that turned his face into a mask of red fury. He jabbed a bony, trembling finger at Marco's chest, his voice reaching a ragged, broken pitch as he declared that he no longer had a son. He shrieked that the DeLuca name was no longer Marco's to carry, and demanded that he get out into the street immediately, with nothing but the clothes on his back. His mother turned her back to the room, staring out the boarded-up window in a silent, final act of excommunication. Marco stood under the weight of the curses, but instead of the expected pain, he felt a strange, crystalline peace. His father pointed toward the door where the machines were roaring, and Marco realized that being erased from this family was the greatest gift they had ever given him. Marco stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, while the world around him dissolved into dust and the screams of labor. He turned his head slowly, watching a deep, jagged crack snake its way down the wall from the ceiling to the floor, exposing the red, soot-stained bricks beneath the plaster. He felt a physical sensation of weight lifting from his shoulders. 30 years of accumulated guilt and false duty simply evaporating into the gray air. The roar of the engines outside no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a symphony of liberation, a grand overture for the end of a lie. The bakery was dying, but the prison cell he had built for himself was collapsing along with it. He took a deep, gritty breath and finally straightened his spine, his eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the hallway. Marco pulled open the heavy, insulated door of the walk-in cooler, and a blast of frigid air hit his face, momentarily clearing the dust from his lungs. In the furthest corner, tucked behind stacks of empty crates, sat a dark, salt-glazed ceramic crock with a jagged hairline fracture near the rim. He wrapped his hands around the cold, sweating sides of the vessel, feeling the familiar texture he had known since childhood. Inside, a thick, bubbling mass of century-old sourdough starter sat, emitting a sharp, pungent tang of fermented grapes and ancient grain. This was the madre, the living heart of the DeLuca legacy that had been fed every day since before he was born. It felt heavy and strangely alien in his hands as the silence of the kitchen seemed to deepen around him. Julia let out a strangled cry and lunged forward, her fingers clawing at Marco's forearm. But he shook her off with a single, powerful shrug of his shoulder. His mother collapsed onto the floor, her wailing muffled by her hands, as Marco tilted the ceramic crock over the industrial sink. The thick, creamy starter began to slide out in a slow, viscous stream, hitting the stainless steel with a heavy, wet sound. He reached over and twisted the hot water tap to its limit. A steaming torrent began to break apart the living culture, dissolving the family's most prized possession into a gray, featureless slurry. The starter vanished down the drain, leaving behind only an empty pot and a lingering, sour scent that the wind from the demolition was already beginning to carry away. Marco gathered the folders from the table, the papers rustling like dry leaves in his grip, and walked toward the yawning, arched mouth of the oven. Deep within the brickwork, a few embers still pulsed with a dull, orange light, radiating a dry, parching heat. He shoved the first stack of ledgers and receipts directly into the coals. The flames instantly caught the dry paper, the legal terms, and carefully recorded debts curling into bright orange scrolls before turning to ash. He watched as 30 years of his silent, unacknowledged servitude were consumed, the black flakes of his past dancing up the flue. The heat singed the hair on his arms, but he didn't pull back until every last page had been reduced to a pile of gray dust that glowed with the ghost of his labor. His fingers found the coarse knot of his apron strings at the small of his back and gave them a violent yank. He pulled the heavy, stained canvas over his head, the fabric stiff with grease, sweat, and the permanent scent of flour. It had been his second skin for decades, a uniform of his own making. He dropped the apron onto the floor, where it landed with a soft thud, immediately disappearing under a layer of the white lime dust that continued to fall from the ceiling. He stepped over the crumpled garment without a second thought, ignoring the dark stains of old oil and the faded blood from his own cracked cuticles. He was left in just his old flannel shirt, and the sudden absence of the apron's weight made his chest feel light, as if he could finally expand his lungs to their full capacity. Marco stepped into the cramped, dark alcove he used for a closet and reached beneath a pile of empty burlap sacks. He pulled out a worn wooden box, its leather strap stiff and cracked with age, but he clutched it to his side with a protective intensity. Behind him, his father's voice rose in a final, wheezing shriek, his arms flailing as he shouted into the dust. But the sound was swallowed by the sudden, thunderous collapse of a section of the upper floor. Marco walked down the narrow, debris-strewn hallway, his boots crunching over shards of glass and fallen plaster. He kept his eyes fixed on the sliver of daylight at the end of the passage, his fingers tight around the handle of his old sketch box, the dried tubes of paint rattling inside like a promise. Julia stood in the doorway, her arms braced against the frame in a desperate, final attempt to block his path. Her face was a ruin of smeared mascara and trembling fury as she demanded the keys to the building, claiming she needed them for the official handover to the developers. Marco didn't stop. He looked straight through her, his gaze as cold and vast as the ocean he had dreamt of. She was a ghost to him now, a flickering shadow that no longer had the power to impede his movement. As he continued his steady stride, she was forced to recoil, her back slamming against the splintering wood of the frame to avoid being trampled. He passed through the threshold without a word, the air around her feeling thin and irrelevant as he stepped into the light. Marco opened his hand, and the heavy ring of brass keys fell to the jagged stone of the threshold with a sharp, final chime. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his eyes stinging as they adjusted to the raw, unshielded glare of the afternoon sun. A few yards away, the massive steel bucket of the excavator hung suspended in the air, its hydraulic lines vibrating with a low-frequency hum that he could feel in his teeth. A foreman in a bright orange vest was shouting into a radio, his eyes wide as he watched the solitary figure emerge from the doomed structure. Marco didn't hurry. He felt the shadow of the machine's arm sweep across his face like a dark wing and kept walking, his back to the door that would never open for him again. He reached the middle of the street just as a deafening screech of tearing metal erupted behind him, followed by the ground-shaking roar of the roof caving in. The earth beneath his boots buckled as the excavator's teeth tore through the main support beams, reducing the bakery to a chaotic heap of red brick and splintered oak. A massive plume of white dust billowed out, swallowing the sidewalk and the street. But Marco didn't turn his head to witness the final disintegration of his past. The thunderous noise eventually faded into the standard, indifferent hum of South Philadelphia, and he felt the invisible tether that had anchored his soul to that corner finally snap. His stride became long and rhythmic, his breathing deep and clean for the first time in 30 years. Marco pushed the heavy wooden frame of the window upward, and a sharp, salt-laden wind surged into the room, scattering a few loose sketches across the floor. The suffocating, sweet-sour smell of yeast and burnt sugar was gone, replaced by the bracing scent of iodine and cold water. Below the window, the Atlantic Ocean was a churning, rhythmic power, its waves shattering against the dark coastal rocks with a sound like deep-voiced thunder. He leaned his elbows on the sill, watching the white foam trace patterns on the sand and the gulls carving arcs against the vast, open sky. In this small, sun-drenched attic room on the coast, there were no ledgers, no family expectations, and no broken machines. Only the infinite, shifting horizon and the clean light of a new day. Marco squeezed a dollop of cerulean blue onto his palette. The color so intense it seemed to vibrate against the white wood. His hand, which had spent a lifetime wrestling with heavy dough, now held a slender brush with a lightness that felt like a miracle. He made the first stroke across the canvas, a bold, sweeping line that defined the boundary between the sea and the sky. He wasn't painting the cramped, soot-stained walls of his memory. He was capturing a space that had no limits. Every new mark he made seemed to draw the light of the room into the fabric. And he felt a strange, tingling warmth in his fingertips, as if the blood were finally flowing into parts of him that had been numb for decades. He picked up a discarded morning newspaper, and his eyes caught a small headline on the third page detailing the spectacular collapse of an investment firm and the subsequent fraud charges against Julia DeLuca. The grainy photograph showed her ducking into a black town car, her face shielded by a designer bag as she fled a swarm of reporters outside the federal courthouse. He read the brief sentences about the liquidation of her assets and the estrangement of her family, but his pulse didn't even quicken. There was no surge of triumph, no lingering bitterness, and no urge to pick up the phone. He folded the paper and set it on the edge of the table next to an old coffee cup, turning back to his easel as if he had just read a weather report for a city he no longer lived in. Marco stepped back from the finished canvas, squinting against the brilliant light that flooded the studio. The colors on the fabric seemed to pulse with life, capturing both the violence of a storm and the profound, crystalline silence that followed it. He looked down at his hands, seeing the bright smears of cobalt and ochre under his fingernails instead of the white ghost of flour. He realized that the ash of the bakery hadn't just been waste. It had been the soil in which this new, authentic life had finally taken root. He caught his reflection in the window glass, a man with a straight back and clear eyes, and he smiled. He had lost everything his family valued, and in doing so, he had finally gained the right to simply exist.